Hello guys, welcome back to our YouTube channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto started the revival of the Uzumaki clan? Part 1. Huge shout out to RUNE71 for this story. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So without wasting any time, let's get into the video. I'm leaving, Sasuke. I have to. The leaf isn't what I remember it to be, with Granny still in a coma and so few of my precious people left. And you. You're always away from the village, the only person that really understood me, and I'm beginning to think that you had the right idea all along. The village will be in safe hands with Kakashi-sensei as Hokage, and by the time he retires, Konohamaru will be old enough and experienced enough to take up the mantle. I've decided to adopt your second ultimate goal. The revival of my clan. Until recently, I wasn't aware that the Uzumaki were an actual clan, but now that I do know, I want to learn everything I can about them. So, I've decided to travel, like the pervy sage, and go to the ruins of Uzumaki and the surrounding lands and ask about my clan, in hopes that I will be able to at least learn of and preserve the culture. I'm sending this note to you because I know that you of all people I can trust not to follow me and convince me to go back. I am not advertising my imminent departure. Naruto. Sasuke read the short letter, no small amount of amusement present in his expression. So the dobe finally did it, huh? He mused aloud to himself. He smirked, a palpable air of smugness surrounding him. Knew he'd do it eventually, the mess the village is in now. And indeed, the Hidden Leaf village was in a bit of a mess, especially from how Naruto would have wanted it to be. Almost all of their graduating class of genin were away, or dead, or incapacitated in some way, shape, or form. Jiraiya was dead. Asuma was dead. Kakashi was Hokage, and like the third before him, couldn't give Naruto much more time but the occasional checkup. He'd heard something awful had happened with Sakura and Naruto just before the war really started, and that they'd been cool towards each other since. Tsunade had been taxed to her absolute limit during the war and had fallen into a coma soon after. And probably something that hurt awfully to the blonde idiot was what had happened with Ichiraku Ramen. The old man running the stand had died just after his daughter had married Iruka, their old sensei from the academy, who Naruto had been close to. And since Konoha apparently reminded the ramen stand man's daughter too much of her father, she moved to the land of lightning, Iruka retiring as a ninja and going with her. So, really, his family wasn't really able to give him what he wanted. Well, best of luck to you, he said, watching the sparks from his small campfire swirl up into the stars. Naruto sighed, staring up at the night sky and wondering whether or not the people at home missed him, or even wondered if he was gone. He was on the roof of Tezuna's house, having run all the way to Wave Country in just 2 days. The first night he'd slept in the rekage of the statues of Hashirama and Madara, remembering the history the place held and the mark he'd made on it with Sasuke. It had been a bittersweet experience, remembering just how he'd gotten so far and how his precious people had been able to help him achieve his goals. But now he had a new goal. He sighed and rolled onto his side, moving his gaze to the spiral symbol on his pack. His clan symbol. His new goal was not one achievable by others, and anybody else traveling with him wouldn't help in the slightest. No, this was a goal he had to achieve on his own. His goal was to learn everything he could about his clan. His next stop would be Uzumaki, to investigate its ruins and see if he could find anything of interest there. But first, sleep. It wouldn't do if he were exhausted on his way there. He might fall in a whirlpool. Well. It's been 2 years. It turns out there weren't any Uzumaki there at Uchiha, but I did find a wealth of knowledge. I was walking along, not really paying attention, and scraped my knee on a rock. Stereotypical me, I guess. Anyway, it activated a blood seal, and it turned out there was a secret basement thing under just about the entire city. It was covered in reinforcement and stasis seals, so the stuff inside was old, maybe even hundreds of years. I used shadow clones to read all of them, got it done in a month. Gave me the worst headaches. But it was worth it. The jutsu, history, festivals, traditions, teaching curricula, sealing techniques, training methods, recorded bloodlines, and what was best of all. Records of the people. I got to see my entire family tree. It was amazing. But Sasuke, I'm leaving. For good. For real. For forever. There was this one seal, an immensely complex space-time jutsu. It sends you through time, Sasuke. As you're reading this, I'm probably already gone. But I want to fix things. I've adjusted the seal so that it comes out a few years after we're born. So you all will be fine. I'll just be trying to make at least one world a better place. You understand, don't you? Well. I guess we'll meet again in death, right? Naruto. And he didn't invite me to go with him. A swish of a cloak and a small smile marked the passage of the ninja through the forest. Usura and Kachi. Ugh. Naruto sat up, groaning, and put his hand to his forehead. Say what he would, that seal was a monster. It had taken more chakra than any other one jutsu he'd ever performed. He'd even been in Sage Bijuu mode, and he'd landed completely exhausted of even the massive chakra stores that state afforded him. He definitely had some sort of chakra exhaustion. He'd only felt like this a few times before, after summoning Gamabunta for the first time, after beating Gaara, after developing the Rasen Shuriken, after fighting Sasuke at the Valley of the End both times, and while fighting the unholy alliance of Obito, Madara, the Juubi and Kagaya. He sat up painfully. Time to sort out priorities. First thing. Find a place to rest and recover. Going to talk to Nagato while weakened so badly wasn't a smart decision. So. He had to get up and use all of his skills to find a place to stay for a couple days. He looked down at himself, checking that first, nothing was broken, and second, he was properly attired in the clothes he'd found in Yuzashigakure while studying there. It all looked good. The blue, brown, and gold complemented each other surprisingly well. He tugged a lock of hair in front of his eyes, checking the color good, a bright red, thanks to a special permanent Bijuu chakra seal. He'd had to do something about it, as there was no way he was going to let himself run around looking like an older Naruto. Which he was, but that was beside the point. Keeping his original appearance would just be asking for trouble, so he changed his hair color. And his eye color, too. Well, he hadn't checked it yet, but if it had worked his eyes should be some shade of indigo. He closed his eyes and tried to go into sage mode, only to pass out again. A few moments later he awoke and laughed, not quite bitterly, but not in happiness, either. He pulled himself up, grabbing a stone next to his shoulder as a support. He wouldn't be trying to access sage mode again anytime soon. Hashirama. He murmured aloud, as anything thinking made his head hurt more, including mental conversation. He kind of felt the deep rumbling snore from the space where the fox resided. He frowned. I guess that answers that. He finally properly looked around. The stone he'd used to pull himself was actually a broken wall. The same broken wall he'd sat on about an hour earlier to eat lunch, although, if the seal had worked properly, it would actually be about 15 years into the future. Confusing. Well. At least he knew where he was. The seal had transported him exactly into the same spot he had performed it from, just altering the time in which he existed. Well. In that case, he thought he'd most likely be able to make it to Wave if he had to. He managed a shaky step forward, leaning against the wall for support. Maybe not. He'd have to find a sheltered area at least. Fat drops of rain were started to fall, and getting soaked wouldn't help his recovery at all. He trudged forward, looking around for a convenient space among the rubble in which he'd be able to rest until the storm stopped. Because he was so exhausted and because he was looking around him instead of down, he didn't notice the small lip of stone still remaining from a doorway and tripped over it, about to face plant into the stone walkway. And then he was caught. Hey, are you alright? Naruto froze. He allowed himself to be pushed back up and helped onto a rock in the sitting position. Man, you look awful. What caused this? And what's your name, anyways? The one who'd helped him was young, probably actually younger than Naruto himself. Maybe 15 or 16. Naruto tried to speak, but his throat had gone dry, nothing came out. He closed it and cleared his throat, trying again. Chakra exhaustion. And I'm Naruto searched for a suitable name. I'm Raiden. He said finally. He'd chosen the name for two reasons. The first, it was partially to honor his father. His Hashirama. The second was that it was a cool name, suitable storm-related like his previous name, and it sounded Uzumaki-ish. Cool name, mine's kind of boring. I'm Satachi. But anyways, time to get out of the rain, yeah. Naruto just looked at him tiredly. Well, follow me, I guess. The other redhead Naruto strongly suspected he was in Uzumaki as well, given his hair and the fact he was wandering around the ruins of Uzashio started off, and Naruto managed to heave himself up off the rock to follow him, but immediately stumbled again and braced himself up against the wall. Satachi noticed his difficulty and came back, slinging one of Naruto's arms around his shoulders to help hold him up. Geez, you really did a number on yourself. What kind of technique uses up that much chakra? Satachi said, curiosity bleeding into every syllable. Naruto gave a strained chuckle before answering. I was working on a transportation seal, he said, and in a way it was true. He was just transporting himself through time, not space. It worked, obviously, but it sapped all my chakra. I'll not be trying it again. Naruto paused and thought about his last phrase. Would he be trying it again, as he'd do it in the future? His younger future self did it. But then since he'd landed there, and if he was going to change things, his younger self would never attempt the time travel seal, which meant he wouldn't have been there in the first place. And then it would be a paradox. The only possible explanation was that Naruto had created a separate reality when he'd landed. At least the reality where he'd come from would be safe. At least from his meddling. Ugh, this was just giving him a headache. So you're really good at seals then? Satachi asked him. Naruto snapped out of his introspection and shook his head. I guess. I've experimented some. I'm just lucky I haven't killed myself on accident with them, he admitted. Satachi laughed. Sure seemed like you tried your very best with this one. But seriously, you're being modest. You made up a transportation seal and used it successfully. That sounds pretty genius to me. My teacher was the one to create that seal, Naruto explained, even though it wasn't quite accurate. Still, he couldn't just say that one of the Uzumaki from the future created it. That would seem rather improbable, and he'd like to keep the fact that he was a time traveler under wraps for a while. I was the one to adjust the coordinates and actually use it. Whoa, that's way cool. Satachi exclaimed. Did your teacher come with you, too? Naruto's expression hardened. He's dead. And indeed, as he remembered Jiraiya, he was reminding himself that coming to the past was more than a way to meet some of his Uzumaki relatives, it was a way to save the people that meant the most to him. Oh. Satachi was quiet the rest of the way to his shelter, which suited Naruto perfectly, as he was losing energy quickly and barely able to set one foot in front of the other at that point. The rain was coming down a bit harder now, and Naruto felt a cold drop slide down the back of his neck and down his shirt. He was so tired he didn't even have the strength to shiver. They were nearly at the edge of the ruins when the blackness that had been hovering at the edges of his vision finally overwhelmed him, and he passed out. There was a fire crackling when Naruto woke up next, and when he opened his eyes, he saw the peaked roof of a tent. It wasn't his tent though, and he sat up. He saw a small pile of gear in the corner of the tent, and the red shirt on top reminded him. It was most likely Satachi's tent. Sure enough, just a few minutes later the young man entered the tent. Oh, you're up. Naruto nodded and pulled a scroll from his belt, flicking it open and withdrawing a bottle of water from one of the seals inscribed. He popped the top off and chugged the entire thing before answering. Yep, he said, resealing the bottle into his scroll and slipping the scroll back into his belt pouch. How long have I been asleep? He asked, making his way out of the tent to stretch and relieve himself. Satachi followed him out. The day would have been day 3, he said. I was starting to get worried you would never wake up. Naruto laughed. Trust me, Satachi, I don't die easy. Satachi still looked skeptical, but Naruto let him be. It wasn't like he hadn't faced skepticism before. Do you have any food? I have a couple ration bars, Satachi answered. I also have some fishing gear in case you want to get some fresh fish or something. Fresh fish sounded excellent, but 3 days of sleeping on top of intense chakra exhaustion made food an immediate priority, and he had his own ration bars. Never mind then. Naruto retrieved a couple bars from his scrolls and unwrapped them hastily, stuffing half of one in his mouth and barely chewing it before he swallowed. It was the best way to eat them, they didn't taste the best. And he was starving. Less than a minute later Naruto was sitting next to the fire, the warmth of which he was using to stave off the pre-dawn chill. He closed his eyes. Kurama. Naruto heard an annoyed snort. I'm sleeping. Or was. What do you want? Naruto smiled. So he was alright, too. Just wanted to check you were alive in there, you old fox, he thought. And you had to wake me up to do that. I'm going back to sleep. Naruto laughed out loud that time and left his mindscape. Satachi was looking at him weird. What was that all about? Satachi asked. He'd just seen Naruto sit down, close his eyes, and then make faces and laugh. It must have seemed rather odd to someone not used to watching him communicate with Kurama. Naruto decided to be straight with him. Just talking to the several thousand-year-old demon in my head, he said blithely. Satachi's eyes went wide. Oh, he said, voice a bit higher than Naruto knew it naturally was. Don't worry, we won't bite. Satachi nodded slowly. Hold on, I'm going to try something, and I wouldn't recommend touching me while I try it. Satachi looked apprehensive, and Naruto was quick to reassure him. I don't think anything would happen to you, but I need to be absolutely still in order for it to work. Satachi looked relieved, and Naruto felt a bit guilty that he'd caused him distress. But he needed to try Sage Mode again, to see if he really had lost it, since he wasn't a Toad summoner in this dimension. It meant he was no longer a Toad Sage, but he wanted to know whether or not he would still be able to harness nature chakra to use Sage Mode. So he held up his fingers in a cross, and another Naruto appeared from the smoke. Alright, boss, it said. I'll whack you if you start looking weird. So no worries. Naruto nodded and sat down in a meditative position, legs crossed and eyes closed. Satachi looked utterly confused. What's he doing? He asked. The clone frowned. He's trying to go into Sage Mode right now. We used to be able to do it, but something happened recently and we're not sure we can right now, so boss is trying it out right now. I'm supposed to whack him if he starts. Oh, Satachi saw that Naruto's cheeks were starting to bulge, and the clone kicked him hard in the shin. Naruto yelped and jumped up, glaring at his clone. No good, boss, the clone said, not very helpfully. You started stretching out like one of the old toads. Naruto frowned sourly and the clone disappeared with a pop and a small cloud of smoke. Well then, Naruto said. Guess I'll have to relearn Sage Mode. Satachi was gawking at him. Who are you? I know you said your name was Raiden, but who are you, really? The young man looked slightly confused, slightly in awe, and slightly accusing. Naruto sighed. Time to test his backstory. Well, my full name is Raiden Uzumaki, if you must know. I was born here, but our village was attacked soon after. I never knew my parents, the orphanage I grew up in told me my name. As soon I was big enough I left, ending up on the streets, where I learned lots of useful things. I hung out in a place with lots of missing nin. I learned quite a bit from them, actually. When I was 13 I met the ninja who would become my teacher, though he was more of a father figure to me. He taught me up until I was 16 years old and then he was killed by a former student of his. Naruto paused. It hurt to remember Jiraiya and then remembered once again that in this world he was alive and Nagato hadn't yet become pain. I spent a few years working on my skills, mostly sealing, and then came here in order to start working on my goal. And what goal is that? To revive the Uzumaki clan. After Naruto had revealed his goal to Satachi, the younger man had become much friendlier towards him, like how he was when he'd helped him that first day. Granted, the sidelong glances were getting old, but as Kurama hadn't yet done anything worth noting, Satachi had calmed down about it. So, what are you going to do first? Satachi asked as he watched Naruto spar one of his clones on the river's surface. Naruto grunted as he blocked a particularly strong blow from his clone and slid back a few inches. He knew exactly what he was going to do. It was what he'd been thinking about non-stop the last week. I'm going to visit AIM. Aren't they in the middle of a civil war right now? And? Oh, right, I forgot, you don't die. Satachi shook his head. I'm being serious right now, Raiden. AIM is in the middle of a civil war. Did you miss the part where I said war? I heard you, Naruto grunted. And I'm being serious as well when I say it's nearly impossible to kill me. You've seen barely a fraction of what I can do. Don't underestimate me. Now that I'm fully recovered, I could take on a full army. Satachi let out a choked laugh. An army? There's no way. I don't believe it. Maybe a squad, but there's no way you can take an entire army. Oh yeah? Naruto challenged. He dissipated the clone he'd been sparring with. Watch this. He crossed his fingers and hundreds of clones appeared on the river, crowding the riverbanks and standing on tree trunks all around. And as if they all had some hidden signal, they burst into flame. It took Satachi several moments to realize that it wasn't real flame, but a beautiful gold chakra engulfing each clone. Even though he wasn't a sensor, he could still feel the massive chakra weighing down the air. He didn't know what the technique did and he wasn't sure he wanted to know either. So what do you think? Satachi whipped around as Naruto spoke from just behind him. The original him hadn't gone into Bijuu mode or started a Rasen Shuriken, but his appearance startled Satachi anyways. He forced a bored look and studied his fingernails. Still think I wouldn't be able to take on an army? Satachi visibly gulped and Naruto dissipated all his clones. You can be really scary sometimes, you know, Satachi said, and Naruto smiled sadly. Maybe, he agreed, but only my enemies should be worried about that. And as a fellow Uzumaki, you'd never be my enemy. Satachi smiled hesitantly and Naruto clapped him on the shoulder. So, what are you going to do in AIM? I'm going to help another cousin win the war. What? Satachi squawked. Naruto laughed. Did I forget to mention that? Another Uzumaki Nagato, I don't think he actually knows he's in Uzumaki is the leader of Akatsuki, the rebel group fighting against Hanzo. I'm going to go help him out. Naruto gave a wry grin. You're welcome to come, if you like. No thanks. Satachi said. Naruto hadn't expected him to agree, as the younger man was obviously Chunin level or less, if he was even a ninja at all. Going into a war zone at his combat level would be tantamount to suicide, and Satachi didn't particularly feel like someone who would do that. Well, I'm going to be in AIM or Konoha most of the time, as long as I can get work there. Here Naruto held out a slip of paper to Satachi. On it was a cryptic symbol in black ink. What is it? It's a seal, for emergencies. It puts up a wall around itself, with a couple meter radius. You send a pulse of chakra into it, you can do that, right? Satachi nodded. So, you send a pulse of chakra into it and a wall will go up. It'll zap anyone or anything that tries to get in and hopefully knock them out for a while. Satachi looked worried, but Naruto didn't know why. He thought they'd already established that Naruto was friendly and would help those he considered family, which Satachi was. So what was it? What's wrong? It's just you know how your teleportation left you were out of it for days. Is this seal going to do something similar? And Naruto understood. Satachi was worried about him. Something warm bloomed in his chest and he realized it was happiness. This teenager had known him for less than a fortnight and he was worried about him. He cared what happened to him. And he was family. It was amazing. No, it's already charged. You only have to trigger it, Naruto said after a moment. It won't drain me like the other one, I'll be fine. And I'm not leaving until tomorrow anyways. Satoshi looked relieved. And if you really want to know, I'm going to stop by Konoha after AIM. If you want to meet me there, I'll be there in a couple months. You shouldn't have much trouble getting there, it's not too difficult, as long as you can get to Wave and have a few coins. Satoshi nodded, looking thoughtful. Well, good night, I guess. Yeah. The next morning Naruto woke up and saw Satoshi roasting a fish over a small fire. His mouth watered, the smell of the fish had permeated the air, and Naruto was hungry. He hopped down from his tree branch and landed next to Satoshi, who held out another fish on a stick to him. You have just become my favorite cousin, Satoshi, Naruto said in the most serious tone he could muster. Satoshi laughed. The rest of breakfast was quiet, Naruto's imminent departure weighing down both of their spirits. Finally the time came where Naruto set down his stick and resealed his possessions. He hesitated before he left, he wasn't used to saying goodbyes. Satoshi, he said haltingly. Satoshi turned around and looked back at him. Yeah? It's just I give up, Naruto said. He went back to Satoshi and embraced him. Good luck, cousin, and safe travels. Satoshi trembled and hugged him back. You too, Raiden, he said. Don't die. Naruto let out a strangled laugh. I won't. They pulled apart and with one last look at some of the first family that either of them had known, they turned away from each other. As Naruto jumped through the trees, he remembered what he had told Inari so long ago. A man only cries when he's happy. Well, he was crying now, and it wasn't just because he was happy. He marveled at the innocence and bravado of his 12-year-old self. It was a bit sad how much he changed, but then again, the world had forced change on him, each new enemy being stronger and crueler than the last. It didn't matter now. Now he was going to stop it. He was going to try and improve whatever he could, starting with Nagato. It took him 5 days of non-stop exhaustive traveling to get to the borders of AIM, and after that he rested one day before trying to enter the country. Which was simultaneously more difficult and not quite as difficult as he had imagined. More difficult in the sense that there seemed to be few opportunities for sleep soldiers and ninja roamed all over the entire country, and sleeping too long meant there was a higher chance he'd get discovered. It was also less difficult in the sense that all the ninja he had noticed had been much weaker than he was. Granted, he was stupidly overpowered, he would admit that to himself, but he'd had to become so to defeat the also stupidly overpowered enemies they'd been facing. Whatever the case, if he had run into any of the ninja there, he would have been able to defeat them all easily. The only ninja he was really worried about encountering were Hanzo and Nagato. He was worried about Hanzo for obvious reasons, really Kurama was good at filtering poisons, but it was said that even Hanzo wasn't immune to his own poison, and that meant there was a high chance it would be able to kill Naruto as well, Jinchuriki or no. He was also worried about Nagato. He and his friends were leading a rebellion. And Naruto was an unknown ninja entering their territory, with no obvious marks of affiliation. He'd have to do some fast-sticking to be accepted or even allowed near the camp and Nagato. Which also brought up the topic. He didn't actually know where Nagato was. Of course, AIM was a rather small country, but it was still an entire country. He didn't have Sage Mode to rely on at the moment and wouldn't have until he trained to use it again, but he didn't know how long that would take. Bijuu mode would probably help, but the most important aspect of the sensing ability was to sense ill intention, which was not really helpful at all actually, because the entire country was in the middle of a civil war and ill will was everywhere. It was time to resort to the classics. Actual human interaction. He asked around in various towns about the Akatsuki, making sure to sound as though he was trying to join them. He also took care to refer to the Akatsuki as a group. It was less threatening than asking after the leaders of said group, especially as the people were rather protective of the people who were protecting them. Eventually he got a solid lead. A small town near the southwestern border was supposed to be a recruitment point. So he pulled up his hood and trudged through the mud fields that made up most of the country's landscape and made his way to the town. The first thing he did there was order a bowl of ramen. He was surprised they had some, actually, but he supposed that the ingredients for ramen were mostly pretty cheap if you didn't add the meat or vegetables. So he got a pretty plain miso, but it was delicious. He'd missed the warm noodles and slurping the slightly oily broth. He could practically feel his energy returning. As he was in the middle of a particularly long and loud slurp, a person sat down next to him. He nearly choked as he saw the red-lined black cloak, the old Akatsuki uniform. But then he remembered that was exactly what he was looking for, as the Akatsuki weren't evil yet, and that if he did choke, it would be a waste of good ramen. So he swallowed, took a breath, and then kept eating. He didn't want to startle the guy, after all, and he couldn't leave his ramen before he finished it. So he kept eating. If the guy wanted to talk to him then he would after he was done. And indeed, when the stand owner asked the guy what he wanted, the guy refused anything. So if he wasn't there for food, he was obviously there for something else, and he didn't seem particularly interested in the ramen stand owner who, by the way, wasn't nearly as welcoming as old man Ichiraku and AM had been. Then he must have been there to talk to one of the customers, of which Naruto was the only one. Finally, with one last long slurp, he set the bowl neatly down on the counter and placed his chopsticks across the top. He then turned to the Akatsuki member. "Hello, my name's Uzumaki Raiden. You?" The guy's eyes widened. "I'm Shin." "But, you said Uzumaki." He seemed astonished, more than Naruto would have expected. "That's right." The man shook his head, and when he looked back at Naruto his face was blank. "What is your purpose and aim?" That was good. Nagato actually, was it Yuhiko at this point? Knew what he was doing. "I heard there was an Uzumaki somewhere around here and I wanted to check it out," Naruto answered simply. It was true, after all, and it would hopefully allow him to get to Nagato sooner. But, of course, the man was a loyal subordinate. Therefore a pain in the butt to anyone new. Shin's gaze turned suspicious. "How do you know that? And how do I know you're actually an Uzumaki?" Naruto groaned. "Why? Could something have been easy just once in his life? Besides the hair and sealing ability and large chakra stores, I can't really prove it. It's not like there's a current family tree floating around somewhere," he answered, annoyed. "Well, do whatever. It's not like you'd be able to get me an audience with this mysterious Uzumaki." Shin looked surprised, then a bit affronted. "I could," he said. "If you just follow me, then I'll take you to Leader Sama and he'll decide whether or not we can trust you." "Yes. Fine. Just let me finish my ramen, will you?" And Naruto proceeded to finish his bowl of ramen under Shin's incredulous gaze. With a final slurp he set his empty bowl down on the counter, along with a few coins, and hopped up. "Let's go." "Fair warning," Shin said as they walked along the street. "As soon as we get out of the city you're going to be blindfolded. Leader Sama doesn't want any outsiders knowing where the camp is." Naruto raised an eyebrow. Didn't the man know that highly trained ninja didn't just rely on their vision? Naruto himself was highly capable at navigating his surroundings without sight. His nose, hearing, and chakra sensing capabilities made up for it. "That's fine," Naruto said. Soon enough, Naruto was blindfolded and was on his way to meet his cousin for the first time. After several hours of walking, Naruto began to hear human sounds. Not the random scuffles caused by wild animals or rushing he associated with high winds or rivers, and not the endless pattering of rain, but clanks and voices and footsteps besides his and Shin's. Lots of footsteps. It was still another 10 minutes or so before the blindfold was pulled off. The shinobi in front of him was Yuhiko. It explained the unfamiliar chakra signature. He'd known it would have been one of the three, but now that he thought about it, he already knew Konan's and Nagato's chakra signature, so of course it was Yuhiko. "Hello," he said brightly. The man's eyes narrowed in confusion. "Hello," he greeted back. "Shin, who is this?" "He says he's Raiden Uzumaki," Shin replied. Yuhiko surveyed him in a new light. He could see it in the change in his posture. "Is that correct?" Naruto nodded enthusiastically. "And your purpose here?" "I wanted to see if the rumors of another Uzumaki here were true. So I came into AIM and then Shin found me." Yuhiko looked surprised. "Is that true, Shin?" Shin nodded, and Yuhiko gave him an approving look. "Good job. Now go and get some rest, you deserve it." Shin left, and Yuhiko and Naruto just stood, observing each other. "You have a high amount of chakra." "I do," Naruto said. "How do you know that?" "Your relative felt your chakra from here, said there was something about it, and asked Shin to track you down." "Shin is one of our best sensors," Yuhiko explained. He was relieved. It seemed as if the man was warming up to him, and Naruto was glad. He'd always wanted to meet the man that Nagato had so admired, and so far he wasn't disappointed. Yuhiko knew his subordinates by name, and this along with his interaction with Shin and Shin's obvious loyalty, proved him to be a good leader. Uzumaki chakra is generally different, more potent than normal chakra. Not to mention that we usually have a lot of it still. I am considered a special case, Naruto said. "Well, Raiden, shall we see if you are telling the truth?" Yuhiko asked, walking up to Naruto's side and leading him to a corridor formed by the rows of tents. Naruto nodded slowly and followed. As they walked, Naruto looked around curiously. Many of the people he saw sported bandages or other such items used to treat injuries, yet it was only a few that radiated negative emotion. He assumed that Nagato's side had the momentum from what he could remember. At this point in time the only conflicts were minor skirmishes, and Akatsuki was gaining followers quickly. They stopped in front of a large tent. "Stay here," Yuhiko ordered, and Naruto stopped. Yuhiko ducked inside the tent. After a couple minutes passed, Naruto unsealed his food scroll from his belt and pulled out a ration bar. He resealed his food scroll back into his belt and started gnawing on the bar. It seemed even preservation seals didn't stop them from tasting stale. Yahiko emerged from the tent and raised an eyebrow when he saw Naruto trying to bite a piece off of the bar. "Where'd you get that?" he asked. Naruto tapped his belt, too busy chewing to give him a verbal answer. "Well. Come in," he said, and Naruto entered the tent. It was pretty much how he'd imagined it: a few cots, a chair, a table with a map of AIM and several little pieces representing different groups of people. And there they were, Konan and Nagato. Naruto's heart swelled as he saw his cousin once more, this time happy and healthy and whole. "Sit down," Yahiko told him. "Konan and I are going to ask you a few questions, and Nagato's going to make sure you aren't lying." Naruto sat down. "What is your name?" Yahiko asked. Naruto thought a moment. If he said Naruto, then Naruto he would be, but then they might become suspicious because of Jiraiya's book. If he said Raiden, then Nagato's jutsu might show that he was lying, but he wouldn't be, would he? Naruto was that blonde, spunky kid who thought anything was possible, as long as he tried hard enough. Naruto was just a little kid, living in Konoha. He wasn't Naruto, not anymore. He was older, different. He was Raiden. "I'm Raiden Uzumaki." He held his breath, and after several long seconds Nagato nodded. Raiden almost couldn't help the grin that threatened to break out on his face. "Where are you from?" "I was born in Konoha. But I traveled a lot." Yahiko and Konan shot concerned glances at Nagato, who nodded, face blank. And then Raiden remembered that it was two Konoha shinobi that had killed Nagato's parents, but then again, Jiraiya was a Konoha shinobi, and they'd been taught by him for years. "What is your purpose here?" Raiden grinned. "I wanted to meet my relative," he said. "See what he was like, you know, but so far he hasn't talked much." Nagato looked confused. "He's telling the truth," Nagato said, "but who is he talking about?" "He speaks," Raiden said, acting shocked. The three gave him surprised looks. "You mean Nagato?" Konan asked. Raiden nodded. "How do you know we're related?" Nagato asked. He looked very confused, and Raiden decided to take pity on him. "There are several distinct trademarks of the Uzumaki clan," he explained. "First is the red hair." "I thought that was an odd coincidence," Yahiko said sheepishly, "but I didn't think anything of it besides that." Konan sighed. "Second," Raiden continued, amused, "is a larger than usual and/or more potent chakra store. Third, a lot of Uzumaki are good at sealing, although I don't know if you've tried it or not. Last but not least, practically all Uzumaki have a special ability tied to their chakra." "What do you mean, special ability?" Nagato asked. Raiden thought a moment before answering, but decided to just go with a few examples he'd seen. "My mother could form chakra chains capable of restraining a Bijuu, which she learned from her great aunt, who had the same ability. One of our cousins can heal injuries by letting the injured person bite her, and is an amazing sensor. I myself have an extreme affinity for using natural chakra and have a sensing ability for negative emotions." Yahiko and Konan both turned towards Nagato, who looked surprised. "He's telling the truth." "Oh, and one more thing," Naruto added, as if it was just an afterthought. "Because Uzumaki chakra is so potent, it has the potential to reawaken lost bloodlines or create new ones." The three shinobi across from him all looked spooked, and Nagato voiced the thought that they all shared. Rinnegan. The Akatsuki camp was a surprisingly pleasant place to be. Sure, it was dirty, often smelled bad, the people's waste had to go somewhere, and they didn't have plumbing and was difficult to navigate. But the people were almost all friendly, and as he was often found in the company of Nagato, he was afforded a small measure of respect until he'd earned it by his own merit. Most of the respect people showed he earned properly. He helped out wherever he could. Waterproofing seals went a long way here. And Raiden's constant friendly and optimistic attitude didn't hurt, either. It was something he still held on to, as he'd learned through experience that a good attitude was better in the long run than a bad one. He didn't know how long he was there, maybe 2-3 weeks. But on a day when the rain was particularly heavy, they received a summons from Hanzo. And Raiden was concerned. As he remembered, Hanzo and Danzo conspired to put down the threat of Akatsuki. He didn't know the specifics, only that they were working together and that during the confrontation, which was supposed to be peaceful, Yahiko died and Nagato went berserk, slaughtering the rest of the Akatsuki and swearing revenge. Konan read the letter aloud. To the leader of the group Akatsuki. I would like to formally request a meeting between our respective parties. The meeting will be non-combative. I will be at Shikatsu Field on the 30th of this month in order to work out an agreement in our mutual goal to strive for peace. You may bring one other person. If you do not come, or if you bring more than one person, I will assume it is a declaration of war and you will be treated as an enemy of the country. Sanshou no Hanzo. It's obviously a trap, Yahiko said, dismissing the letter quickly. There's no way we can trust him, he's done nothing for this country for the last decade except sit in his palace. Raiden mentally agreed, but he also knew that the confrontation was necessary for Hanzo to be dethroned. And in order for AIM to prosper, Hanzo had to be dethroned. Be that as it may, Nagato argued, this is our only chance to confront Hanzo before we are officially labeled as enemies to the state. A lot of supplies we receive right now are from merchants sympathetic to our cause. As soon as we are officially enemies, it becomes a lot more dangerous for them to be supplying us. I don't want to put loyal citizens in that position. I agree with Nagato, Conan said. Just think about it, Yahiko, right now the only conflict we've seen are minor skirmishes. If we don't show up, we will officially be at war. If we do go, and it is a trap, then we will fight, which is the same thing that will end up happening eventually if we don't go. I see. Yahiko looked pensive. Then Nagato and I will go. Conan looked ready to protest, then noted Yahiko's expression and sighed. Raiden decided it was time for him to butt in and add his 2 cents. And right now, you have a secret weapon. He exclaimed, grinning. And what's that? Yahiko asked. They all had matching confused expressions. Me? Nagato and Conan both gave him small smiles, but Yahiko just looked incredulous. You? I know you said you're in Uzumaki, but seriously, there's no way you can make that big of a difference. He said. And if Hanzo notices you there, we're all dead. Raiden just grinned slyly. I have a seal to block my chakra signature, although it only does work on me, and as for the making a difference part. Are you sure about that? He asked. And Yahiko suddenly looked unsure. Can you? I'll give you a small demonstration, just bring me to a place you wouldn't mind getting blown up. And so they led Raiden out to an empty field a short distance away, on which several members, around 20 or so of the Akatsuki, were practicing jutsu in small groups. Raiden made several clones, which he sent to warn them. They came over by the small group, curiosity written all over their faces. What's going on? One of them asked. The clone told us we should come over here so we wouldn't get injured. Yeah, same for us. Raiden said he was going to give us a demonstration of his jutsu, Conan answered. Raiden plopped down on the ground in a meditative posture, facing away from them, disregarding the mud soaking his pants and everything going on around him. Thanks to the few weeks of relative downtime he'd had in the camp, he'd been able to access Sage Mode, not Toad Sage Mode, like before, but pure unstructured nature chakra. And then he remembered that he couldn't do the Rasen Shuriken. He ran over the list of techniques he knew, trying to find one suitably destructive. He could do a couple of them at the same time to strengthen it if he needed to. After just a couple of minutes, he popped up, eyes open, and turned to face them. They looked startled, and Raiden realized he hadn't yet seen his face in the new Sage Mode. He made a couple clones. Hey, the new Sage Mode looked pretty cool, and started charging up for the jutsu. You're gonna want to see this, he said, grinning madly. It felt great to finally use one of his upper-level techniques after downplaying his strength for so long. Wind release. Drilling air bullet. He and his clones inhaled, chests puffed out almost comically, then each of them thumped their chest and spat out a sphere of super compressed air. Raiden knew it looked a bit goofy, but it sure worked. The first time he'd seen it was when he was up against Shukaku, and the Bijuu had leveled an entire forest with it. The spheres joined in midair about 20 meters away, expanding into one much larger sphere. It flew into a small column of rock, blasting through, scattering debris and rock shards everywhere. It barely slowed. Keep watching, Raiden told them, a battle-happy grin on his face. And then it hit the ground and exploded. The pressure was suddenly released, expanding into a shockwave of hot, dry air that blew everyone's hair back from their faces, despite being at least 70 meters away. It tore up the ground around it, spattering mud everywhere. After several seconds, the noise stopped and the mud storm died down, leaving a sizable crater where it had hit. "Ah," he said, bouncing in place. "Pretty cool, huh? Aren't I awesome? Aren't I?" There was no response, so he turned to them. They all looked shocked. "What? I'm glad he's on our side," one of the ninjas said. The first thing Raiden did on the morning they were supposed to meet with Hanzo was to go into Sage Mode and survey the camp and the surrounding area for Conan's chakra. As he suspected, it was nowhere to be found. That meant Hanzo already had her. He wasn't overly worried, she'd be kept safe at least until Hanzo threatened her in front of Yahiko and Nagato, but that was what he'd be there to stop. He reapplied the chakra masking seal and emerged from his tent to meet with Yahiko and Nagato, who were both looking rather grim. "Ready?" Yahiko asked the two of them. Raiden nodded, Nagato doing the same, but looking a little less certain. "Then let's go." They shot off, leaving the camp behind and heading towards the meeting place. There was a tense silence the whole way there, and it was wearing down on Raiden's nerves despite knowing about Hanzo's treachery and having already come up with a plan to deal with it. When Raiden felt a large concentration of chakra up ahead of them a short distance, he used Jiraiya's old camouflage jutsu and slipped away a short distance, letting Nagato and Yahiko land before Hanzo's forces. He felt twin spikes of rage and worry as they realized Conan was the one being held by Hanzo and heard Hanzo issue his challenge. Your gang is a hindrance to my plans. Yahiko as the leader, you will die here today. If you don't, this girl will get it. Raiden heard the thwick of a kunai hitting the earth and knew it was his time to act. He took a deep breath, released it, then made an exploding shadow clone. The clone transformed itself into Konan, then near flawlessly performed Kawarimi to swap with Konan. She appeared next to him, startled, but thankfully stayed quiet. He grinned, whispered, "Watch," and they both peeked out over the top of the rock he was hiding behind, just in time to see the clone give Hanzo a nasty grin and explode in his face. From their vantage point they could also see Nagato and Yahiko's faces, both relieved and completely baffled. Konan giggled, Raiden chuckling as well. Raiden pulled the seal tag off that concealed his chakra and jumped out to Nagato and Yahiko, Konan right behind him. "I heard there was a party going on," he said. "Why didn't you invite me, guys?" "Oh, free kunai." He picked it up from the ground and grinned. He felt Hanzo's anger rise, wrath and menace, forming an aura around him. That wasn't good. He still was able to enjoy their expressions of bewilderment, though they were funny. Yahiko shook off his confusion and smirked. "Didn't mean to ignore you," he said. "Glad you could join us." The smoke from the clone's explosion cleared and Raiden smiled. "Let's go wild." The battle went mostly as expected. Hanzo was defeated thanks to the combined efforts of Nagato, Yahiko, and Konan, and his chakra was locked thanks to a timely seal application by one of Raiden's clones, and what was left of his force surrendered. Raiden spent most of his effort tackling Danzo and his forces. His army of clones handily took care of the nameless route. Danzo, however, through Sage mode and a liberal use of shadow clones, as well as wind-natured techniques and seals, he was able to finally tire the man out enough that he was able to slap him with a temporary chakra-disrupting seal. The half-second the seal gave him was enough to knock the man unconscious. He didn't know what effect killing Danzo would have on the political structure of Konoha. So however unfortunate it was, the man would have to be kept alive until the politics mess there could be sorted out. He left Danzo on the ground and regrouped with the other three. He knew the man would wake up eventually, but he was actually counting on that because Danzo going missing would put the third on alert, not to mention what would happen to Sai if he were killed, but it boiled down to: if he killed Danzo and the third heard about it, that was bad. So, unfortunately, the man would have to live. Yahiko had Hanzo's unconscious body draped over his shoulders. It was for proof he was actually defeated, and the surviving Aim-Nin huddled behind them. "So, what's next?" he asked. "Politically speaking," Konan said, "what's next is a visit to the daimyo, so he'll support us. And we'll need Hanzo to tell the daimyo he wishes to resign and that he's appointed Yahiko as his successor." "Gotcha. Wait till Hanzo wakes up, make him write a letter to the daimyo requesting an audience with him, and then go there with a contingent of your Akatsuki and have him appoint Yahiko as the leader of a megacur. Good plan, I approve." Yahiko raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean you approve? It doesn't matter if you approve or not. You're not the daimyo." He paused, his face growing horrified. "Are you?" Raiden stayed quiet, holding in all his amusement, and looked imperiously down his nose at Yahiko. "HN." And then his face looked hilarious, and he heard Nagato's muffled snort of amusement, and he couldn't hold it in anymore. He burst out laughing, and Yahiko's face turned from horrified to mortified. "You?" And then their victory against the combined forces of Hanzo and Root turned into an undignified game of tag. "Sorry, guys, but I really do have to go now. It just wouldn't be fair to all the others if I stayed here, no matter how much I want to," Raiden said. "But you'll come visit, won't you?" Konan asked. Raiden nodded. "Of course. See you later, Nagato, Konan, oh great leader Yahiko," he said with a smile, before setting off towards Konoha. He waited until he gauged that he was sufficiently far away to charge up Bijuu mode and took off. "Hey Kurama. Yeah? Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" "Kid, don't doubt yourself. There are no instructions for something like this, you just have to play it by ear. Doubt will only slow you down." "Alright then." He could still feel the doubt in him, working its hardest to dim his will of fire. And he didn't know how to stop it. "Naruto." He raised his head. Kurama had used his real name. Not a nickname, like Kid or Brat, and not even the name he was using. Kurama had called him by his true name, the name he'd inherited, which brought with it a will to never give up. If you start doubting yourself, just remember why you came here in the first place. You've already saved Yahiko from dying and Nagato from becoming something he would have hated. And you can still save others. The third, Jiraiya, that Hyuga boy. You've come here to the past, and you can't go back now. Just do what you can. Thanks Kurama." He only used a chakra cloak to travel about an hour every day. It covered the same distance a normal ninja would in half a day. The rest of the time, he worked on his Sage mode. Thanks to the practice he'd done in the Akatsuki camp, he was able to enter Sage mode fairly consistently, but it took far too long. He needed to cut the time down to less than a second. And that meant, "Alright, you lot. time to practice. Spamming shadow clones. Despite this, it only took him a week to get to where he recognized the forest around him. He slowed down to a walk. He was an unregistered person with shinobi skills, and to come running into a ninja village without an invitation was considered extremely poor manners. Well, it was actually closer to a declaration of war, but whatever. Still, the point of coming to Konoha was to foster a positive relationship with them, so he'd be a good little ninja and obey the rules. At least until he got the political part settled, then it wouldn't matter if he played a prank or two. He grinned as the Great Walls and Green Gates came into view. He had really missed the sight of them. Though they looked less worn than he remembered, the paint a little less faded and of that long scratch absent, they felt the same, welcoming and open. He strolled up and stopped at the gate station. He was confused at the lack of the two chunin he remembered, Izumo and Katetsu, before realizing they were most likely still genin at the moment. The two guards currently on duty acted much the same, though, as one guard was reading a book with a dull green cover and the other was asleep. "Excuse me," Raiden said. The guard that had been reading sat up, shoved his book under the desk and cleared his throat while nudging the other, who started and sat up blearily. "What can I do for you?" the guard asked. "I want to see your Hokage," Raiden announced. The guard looked him over critically. "Do you have documentation?" Raiden fished around in his pants pocket and withdrew a wad of folded papers, thanking Nagato for his foresight and willingness to help out, as the papers made him an official AIM citizen. He handed them over to the guard, who examined them and gave him a different piece of paper which was thicker and had a stamp on it. "This is a temporary pass," the sleepy guard explained. "It expires in 2 weeks, so you better be out by then or get a permanent pass or something. Good luck." Raiden nodded cheerfully and turned to head into the village before stopping abruptly and going back to the post. Which direction do I go to find where the Hokage lives?" he asked, smiling sheepishly. The guards looked at each other before they burst out laughing, and Raiden just stood there, small grin still fixed. Never underestimate the power of stupidity. It, in turn, leads others to underestimate the one smiling. They calmed down, and the sleepy one said, "Just follow the road to a tall round red building. Ask for more directions at the desk there." "Thanks," Raiden said, then decided he'd wasted enough time and used Shunshin to get to the building. To keep up the charade, he asked directions to the Hokage's office and headed up. Lucky for him, the old man was free. "Yo," he said as he walked in. "Nice to meet ya, Hokage-sama. Man, you're old." Raiden struggled to keep a straight face as he saw the old man's slightly baffled expression. "Do I know you?" he asked, and Raiden shrugged. "Probably not, I've never seen you before." The old man looked even more confused, and Raiden was sure he was annoying Kurama with the cackling he was doing in his head before he realized that Kurama was cackling right along with him. "Anyways, I've come because my cousin's friend just became the leader of AIM and wants an alliance." "Oh yeah, do you happen to have any good ramen shops?" Raiden noted with pride that the old man's pipe was tilted dangerously. He wondered absently if he could get it to fall out entirely. "Oh, I'm Uzumaki Raiden, by the way. And success. Goodbye, pipe." The old man was frozen for a good 10 seconds, but then he cleared his throat and moved his pipe off of the pile of papers and onto a bare spot on his desk. "Well," he said, "Ichiraku's ramen is quite good, if I do say myself. As for the alliance, I will have to meet with him in person." Did he have any particular information about when and where he wanted to meet? And about the general state of affairs in AIM? Raiden scratched his head. It was really fun playing stupid. Yeah, hold on. And then he realized that he'd actually forgotten where he'd put Yuhiko's message. Well, really it was Nagato and Konan who'd written most of it. So he began the long process of looking through his seal belt. He unsealed everything that he had in his belt and was rather surprised to find that it made a pile just over a meter high of both other storage scrolls varying in content and random junk he'd collected. "Wow. I really need to sort out my crap." He turned and addressed the Hokage. "You don't mind if I move all this to a corner so I can find it, do you?" The Hokage nodded absently, evidently still a bit baffled. So he moved all his stuff over to a corner and sat down in the middle of it, sorting through his stuff. He made several piles. Food, that's where his limited edition instant ramen went. Water, why did he have so many water bottles? Half of which were empty. Weapons, he thought he had gotten rid of that giant mace years ago. Clothes, he didn't have any orange left. And a miscellaneous pile. Several clients came and went while he was busy sorting in the corner, but after a quick wave and smile and cheerful "don't mind me" and several dubious looks, they went back to their business. At around 5 o'clock he'd finished sorting his stuff and had resealed it all into his belt. He stood up and stretched. "Man, that took forever," he said. "Did you find the letter?" the old man asked. "What letter?" "The one from your cousin's friend." "Oh, that. No, actually." Raiden couldn't believe he had actually forgotten. Maybe it was the atmosphere, he hadn't gotten to relax properly in ages, and being in the Hokage's office with the old man had put him completely at ease and he hadn't even noticed. It's odd. I could have sworn. Raiden frowned. That really wasn't good. If he didn't find that paper. He stuck his hands in his pockets in dejection and his hand met with a clump of papers. He pulled them out slowly. There was his AIM citizenship papers and his temporary visa and the letter from Yahiko. "Here you go," he said, grin back on his face. It was good he hadn't lost it. That could have been disastrous. And he was still finding amusement in the old man's expressions. He figured he'd inflicted enough of his particular brand of amusement on him for one day and bowed. "By your leave, Hokage-sama. You may be dismissed." Raiden left the office with a cheery wave and walked out, heading straight to Ichiraku's ramen. He hadn't had it in ages. That stuff in AIM just hadn't hit the spot. And just for fun, he decided he'd skip there. "Why do you insist on making a fool of yourself? Hirama, just think of it like I'm playing a prank on the entire village. At this point all they have observed about me is that I'm airheaded and have some skill in sealing. Plus, it's kinda fun. And what's more, the lower their expectations are of me, the more I'll be able to accomplish under their noses and the less I'm obligated to do. I just wish it didn't make you, and by extension me, look so stupid." Raiden stopped dead. That smell. He turned the corner and saw the most amazing ramen restaurant in all of the shinobi nations. He rushed up and snagged a seat. "Hey, can I get a miso?" he called. The old man, actually not so old yet, turned. "Coming right up," he said. "I haven't seen you before, though you do look kind of familiar." He shook his head. "Sorry about that. Are you new here?" "Oh yeah, I just got here actually. I asked Hokage-sama for a recommendation for a place to eat and he told me to go here, so I did. I've only been in Konoha for a few hours." "How are you liking it?" the man asked, stirring the pot of noodles as they boiled. "Well, I've actually been in the Hokage's office the whole time. I misplaced a letter I was supposed to deliver to him and had to find it." Raiden laughed embarrassedly and rubbed the back of his head. Ichiraku laughed along with him. "Well, for what it's worth, welcome to the village, Shinobi-san." "Wait, you're a ninja?" Raiden looked to his left and nearly jumped out of his skin when he realized he was sitting next to his 6-year-old self. "Sure am. Uzumaki Raiden, at your service." Raiden kept a watchful eye out during his proclamation and was pleased with the reactions he saw. Ichiraku had actually dropped his spoon, though he caught it again before it hit the floor and Naruto had stopped eating. "Uzumaki?" Naruto asked pitifully, and Raiden's heart hurt as he saw the faint hope in the boy's eyes. "Like me? You're in Uzumaki?" Raiden asked, though he already knew the answer, knew much more about it, in fact, than the young boy himself did. "Yeah. Nice to meet ya. What's your name?" "I'm Naruto." "Welcome to the family, Naruto." And then his younger self started bawling, and Raiden remembered the first time he'd been acknowledged like that and how emotional he'd been. "Hey, don't cry, you don't want your noodles to get soggy, do you?" And so Naruto sniffed and wiped at his eyes with his sleeve and started eating his noodles again. Ichiraku had finished Raiden's own noodles and he got his bowl and started eating as well, explaining to Naruto about what he was doing. Raiden knew that he wouldn't be able to interact with his younger self as much as the boy would like, but it wouldn't be fair to him to tell him that they were family and leave without any explanation. And he also knew that if he asked Naruto to stay quiet about it, he would, if only because someone had acknowledged and trusted him to do something, and the boy didn't want to betray that trust. "I'm actually here for one of our other cousins. The Uzumaki are a scattered clan, you know, and there aren't many of us left, and some don't even know they have Uzumaki blood, but we have a cousin named Nagato in AIM, who is best friends with their new leader, their teammates, and his friend Yahiko asked me to give a letter to the Hokage for them, which is what I was doing today." Naruto's eyes were wide, and Raiden was glad he was able to make the kid happy. It was something he had no doubt been sorely lacking in his life so far. "So, our cousin Nagato, he's really important?" "Yup." Raiden nodded after taking another slurp of his noodles. He had forgotten how good they were. "He's a super cool ninja, just like me. I'm gonna be a super cool ninja someday, too, just you wait. I'm gonna be the Hokage." Raiden nodded at his younger counterpart's enthusiasm. He missed those relatively carefree days. "Go for it, kid." They ate their ramen quietly for a while, until both bowls had been emptied and refilled and emptied again a few times. Raiden put some money on the counter, paying for both his and Naruto's meals, and walked off. Naruto followed him. "Do you have a place to stay?" he asked, and Raiden looked down at him. He hadn't found one yet, and he had all his gear with him, so even if he didn't he'd be comfortable, but staying with Naruto could benefit him in the long run. "I don't actually," he admitted. "You wanna come stay at my place?" Raiden smiled at him. "Sure, why not?" So Naruto moved slightly in front of him, and Raiden wondered when his life had stopped making sense. He followed Naruto to the apartment building he remembered so well and breathed in. It smelled the same. Slightly musty. Kind of gross. Yep. That was one thing he had to be thankful of Nagato for. His attack on the other Konoha had knocked down the building and he'd gotten a much nicer apartment. A couple flights of stairs later, Naruto opened his door with his key and stepped in, taking off his shoes and setting them in front of the step. Raiden followed, smiling at the sight the two pairs of shoes made next to each other. Naruto's shoes were blue and so small compared to his mud-caked dark gray sandals. He shook his head and continued in. You can sleep on the couch. It's long enough, I think. And, the bathroom is right there, but I don't always have hot water so you might get a cold shower. Is that okay? Yeah, Raiden said. It's great. Naruto looked relieved and disappeared into his bedroom. Raiden chuckled. It would seem that the kid was self-conscious. He decided then and there that he'd stay the whole 2 weeks his visa permitted and send a shadow clone out if he needed to send word back to AIM. There was no way he could leave Naruto like this, hadn't he wished in his own childhood for an opportunity that he had the chance to give the kid. He unsealed his camping equipment and withdrew a blanket, then took off his shirt and folded it up for a pillow. Everything else could wait until tomorrow. Raiden woke with a start, immediately calming when he took in his surroundings. He was just in his old apartment. Wait, what? He sat up, looking around. Oh, yeah, he was staying with Naruto. He shook his head to clear it and walked sleepily over to the bathroom to relieve himself. He decided he'd take a shower, too. Nothing better than a freezing shower to chase away grogginess. He walked out after finishing, only to bump into Naruto. The boy was barely awake and obviously needed to pee. Raiden chuckled. Some things just never changed. He dressed quickly and headed into the kitchen to start cooking breakfast. Except it was a disaster. He couldn't find a clean pan in sight and Naruto had no food in his fridge. Well, no food worth eating. The cupboards, he knew, would only contain various kinds of instant ramen. So, with a sigh, he sent out a shadow clone to buy some groceries and started cleaning the dishes that were scattered around the kitchen. By the time Naruto had finished his own shower, Raiden had succeeded in cleaning all the dirty dishes shadow clones may or may not have been used liberally and was making tamagoyaki. Here you are, Raiden said, placing a plate in front of Naruto and putting several pieces on. Eat it, it's good. Naruto took a bite of one, chewed a bit, then took another huge bite. His cheeks were bulging and said, "Biff is wee wee goof." They chew, swallow, then talk. Naruto chewed furiously, then swallowed, and then said, "This is really good." "You think so?" Raiden asked. Tamagoyaki was pretty good, it was one of his breakfast favorites, so he'd taught himself to make it. And Naruto did need more variety in his diet, so. "I can teach you, if you like." He finished the second batch and set it on his own plate and sat down to eat with Naruto, leaving the pan to cool. He'd go back and wash it later. Tamagoyaki he hadn't had it in a while. He made a shadow clone, who sat at the end of the table, and Raiden passed it a sheet of paper and a pen. The clone started writing. "Whoa, that's so cool." Naruto exclaimed. "What's it doing?" "It's writing down the instructions for making tamagoyaki, which is what this is," Raiden explained. Naruto looked downcast all of a sudden and set his chopsticks down gently on his plate, making a quiet clack. His bangs shadowed his eyes, obscuring his expression. I don't read so well," he said. Raiden winced. How could he have forgotten? He hadn't known a lot of the kanji kids were expected to know upon starting the ninja academy. Quite a few were taught by parents, and without any parents, there really wasn't much he could do to teach himself. By the time he'd met old man Ichiraku, he'd been old enough that asking him to teach him was just awkward. And the old man Hokage was always busy, he didn't have time to teach him. "He'll write it as simply as he can," Raiden reassured Naruto. "And I'll tell it to you, too." "Okay then." Crisis averted, Naruto was back to being happy. The clock struck 8 and Raiden looked up. "Don't you have school?" "Oh yeah. I forgot." Naruto looked greatly alarmed. "When does it start?" Raiden asked. "In 5 minutes." "Alright, hold on," Raiden said and picked Naruto up. He jumped out the window and ran up to the roof. "What direction?" Naruto pointed and Raiden raced across the roofs. "There." Naruto yelled and Raiden dropped down in front of the doors. "When's your lunch?" 1:30. "Alright, good, I'll bring one to you. Now, you've got 2 minutes, go, and don't be late." "Okay." And with that, Naruto ran into the building. Raiden realized he was smiling. Naruto, he was still such a happy kid. Of course, he had made some rather depressing faces while mentioning his lack of reading skill, but he still had that naive belief in the inherent goodness of people and love of life that had marked his ninja way while young. And Raiden was going to keep it that way as long as he possibly could. He stuck his hands in his pockets and meandered away. First up was going back to Naruto's apartment and cleaning up the dishes. He got in easily, the window was still open from his exit earlier, so he didn't have to worry about the door. He found some soap under the sink and used it to wash the pan and set it out to dry, then sat at the table. Time to make a plan. Seeing the Hokage again would have to be done that day, as he'd left rather abruptly the day before, and he hadn't given the man a way to contact him though as the Hokage, he probably didn't matter. Still. He wanted to make a good impression. And then there was the matter of Naruto. He'd promised to make the kids lunch, but the boy had no good food in his kitchen. That meant grocery shopping, the supplies he'd bought for breakfast wouldn't be enough for the rest of the week. And with the diet thing, well, he'd have to write up a list of things a growing boy would be able to cook. But first things first. He needed to see the Hokage. He stuck his head upside down into the old man's window and dropped in, flipping back upright. "What's up?" he asked, and then noticed there was another person in the office. "Satachi. Long time no see." "Raiden." He held his hand out for a fist bump, which Satachi returned happily. "It seems that the two of you know each other," the Hokage remarked dryly. "Perhaps you could save your reunion until later." "Right, sorry," Raiden said, and moved to the back of the room while Satachi received a semi-permanent visa. Those lasted 6 months, give or take, so that actually solved a lot of the problems with Naruto, as long as Satachi was willing to help. "Your turn, Raiden." He was snapped from his thoughts to see Satachi exiting the office, leaving him alone with the Hokage. "Right," Raiden said. "Any progress?" "I have read the letter," the old man answered, "as have my advisors, but we have not yet come to a decision. You may return in 10 days to receive our response." The old man looked serious, and Raiden knew it wasn't time to fool around. "Okay then," he said simply. "I will return then. In the meantime, is there anywhere I could go for a quick spar?" The Hokage raised an eyebrow, but answered his question. "We have training fields all around the edge of town. You are welcome to go investigate." And then he went back to his paperwork, and Raiden left the office by the door to catch up with Satachi. "How have you been?" he asked, coming up silently behind his cousin. Satachi jumped, making Raiden snicker, and turned and started whacking him. "Come on, Raiden. Don't do that." But Satachi was grinning, so Raiden knew he wasn't really mad. It was good to see him again, he hadn't expected to meet up again until much later, at least until he'd sorted out the whole aim situation. "Aw, come on," Raiden trailed off, and then he realized Satachi didn't know about Naruto. That needed to change right away. "Guess what? So, we have a little cousin here, his name's Naruto, and he's not very well off, so, you want to meet him? I'm giving him his lunch later." Satachi's expression softened from grudging amusement to something warmer. "I'd love to." "Great." Raiden saw a grocery store and tugged on Satachi's arm. "Come on, let's go in here, I've gotta get some food." "What's with the grocery binge?" Satachi asked after they exited the store, completely weighed down with bags. "This is enough food for a month." "Nonsense. For 3 people, especially Uzumaki, it'll probably just be enough for a week," Raiden said. 3. "Yeah. You and I are going to be staying with Naruto for a while." "We are?" Satachi asked, completely baffled. Won't he be irritated at 2 near strangers butting into his life? Raiden expertly maneuvered through the twisting maze of streets in the direction of Naruto's apartment. "No," he said, starting to explain to Satachi the particulars of the boy's situation. "Naruto is a 6-year-old orphan who is not in a particularly good standing with the citizens of the village because of something completely outside of his control. Having 2 people come to help take care of him, that's like his biggest dream, besides becoming Hokage, of course." "Oh." Raiden led him up the stairs, as Satachi didn't have the ability to climb up walls. "Man, this place is pretty run down," Satachi said, and Raiden looked up. It really was. The paint was patchy, the walls were scratched, and the stairs made ominous creaking noises when they were stepped on. He hadn't really noticed it before, but he picked the lock quickly enough that Satachi didn't notice and let them both into the apartment. The both of them went straight to the kitchen to deposit the food. Satachi opened the fridge to start putting stuff in. "Oh, gross," he said. "This apple is totally moldy, and this milk is expired by a week. Does this kid ever clean?" "Satachi. He's 6. Right, forgot about that." Raiden found him a rag and the same soap from before for him to clean out the fridge, which he managed with great efficiency and several complaints. Aside from that, the groceries were put away without much difficulty. Satachi also had several remarks to make about the size of Naruto's ramen collection. "What time is it?" Raiden asked. Satachi looked at Naruto's clock. 4 to 1. "Cool. Wait, wasn't Naruto's lunch at 1:30? Crap. I gotta make his lunch." Raiden rushed to the kitchen to start preparing. 25 minutes later he had a neat colorful bento box. "Come on, Satachi, let's go. Naruto's lunch starts in 10 minutes and that's about how long it takes to walk there." The two of the exited, Raiden making sure to lock the door before he closed it. The walk to the school was pretty quiet. Satachi was busy looking around, memorizing the route, and Raiden was lost in thought about what they could do to help Naruto. With Satachi's help it would be much easier, but there were times Naruto would have to do things by himself. They'd have to teach him how to disguise himself properly. And they'd have to work on reading. Basic nutrition Satachi could help a bit, but Raiden didn't know if he knew how to actually cook. And that apartment, it was old, run down, and rickety. Not to mention the boy's personal hygiene habits. His clothes were alright for now, and though he deeply regretted it, orange was a great color, he would have to prevent Naruto from getting those orange jumpsuits somehow. They were awesome for practically anything but ninja missions, which did often require some sort of finesse. But that could wait until a bit later, the school was just up ahead and he wanted to see Naruto. Just in time, Satachi said, both of them hearing a bell that signaled the beginning of lunch. They headed around the side of the building to the schoolyard. Naruto's chakra was a bright flare amongst the duller embers of his peers, and it was easy to track his location. "Hey Naruto." Raiden called, making sure to raise his voice so that the boy could hear him. "Over here." Naruto bounded away from the small group of boys he was with, and a huge grin appeared on his face. "You came?" he exclaimed, tackling him. "Of course I did," Raiden said, ruffling the boy's hair and making sure the bento didn't get squashed. "That's what?" Raiden asked, moving the bento box around behind him. "What?" Naruto asked suspiciously. "I have your lunch," Raiden said, handing Naruto the bento box. "And I found another cousin. His name's Satachi. Say hi Satachi." Satachi shot him a glare before turning to Naruto, a pleasant smile now on his face. Naruto giggled. "What's up?" he said amicably. Naruto smiled again. "Nice to meet ya, I'm Naruto." "Nice to meet you too, Naruto. But you better go and eat your lunch now, we can talk properly after you come home from school. Make sure you do well, okay?" Naruto nodded dramatically. "Okay." And then he ran off, back to the group of boys he'd been with earlier. Raiden watched him go, then glanced at Satachi, who was watching the boy cynically. "So what do you think?" he asked. He was rather curious to know Satachi's opinion of his younger self. "His hair is the wrong color." Raiden turned and gave him a look. "Are you serious right now?" "Well, it's true. One of his parents probably wasn't Uzumaki." Satachi sighed. "Well, other than that, he's a pretty cute kid." "Are you sure he's 6, though? He's awfully small." "I'm sure. It was at 6 years old that he himself had started living alone. What do you say we help him out?" "Of course," Satachi replied simply, as if there wasn't any question about it. "He's family, isn't he?" It seemed the legends of the Uzumaki family ties were true, after all. Satachi felt it, accepting both him and Naruto. Raiden had felt it, the protectiveness towards Nagato and Naruto and Satachi, even though he'd not met him in his previous timeline. And Naruto had instantly accepted the both of them. It was great to have a family. "I'm home." Raiden heard Naruto call. "Welcome home, Naruto. Satachi and I have something we want to talk with you about, is that okay?" Naruto looked nervous. "Don't worry, Naruto, it's nothing bad," Satachi said. "Here, have a snack." Satachi handed Naruto a handful of rice crackers, which he accepted gratefully. "We were thinking," Raiden said, "that since I travel a lot and Satachi is going to be staying here long term, that maybe we could get a bigger apartment or a house for all of us to share. That way it'll be cheaper for all of us and we get to stay with each other. How does that sound?" Naruto's eyes widened. "You mean it? I'll get to stay with you?" "Sure. Why not?" Satachi said. "There'll just be a couple of rules, make sure you help clean up sometimes and do well in school. Pretty good deal, right?" Naruto burst into tears and ran to hug Satachi, who pulled him up on his lap and held him, making comforting noises. Raiden raised an eyebrow and Satachi shrugged slightly. He guessed he'd leave the comforting to Satachi, then. With only a couple of prompts from the both of them, Naruto started on his homework and with their help was able to complete it. "Alright then, what next?" Satachi asked. "His homework is done, I have the day off, and you don't have to be anywhere, right Raiden?" Raiden nodded. The three of them sat there, mostly at a loss of what to do. There weren't many things that spanned the interests of a 19-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 6-year-old. And then Raiden thought of something extremely important. "Oh, I know. Let's play hide and seek." The other two looked at him like he was crazy. "I don't think it's gonna work," Naruto said. "I think it's too easy in here." Satachi nodded his agreement. "I don't mean in here," Raiden said. "Outside. We'll make it so that you have to stay on a certain street, the one with the farmer's market, where there's lots of people. Oh, and the hiders will be disguised." A smile grew on Satachi's face, but Naruto looked dismayed. "But I don't know how to disguise myself. I don't even know how to do my katra yet." Satachi and Raiden both chuckled. Chakra, Naruto, Raiden corrected gently. That's okay, though. I'll explain it better. One of us, he said, gesturing to Satachi and himself, will be the seeker. The other person will help you get disguised and teach you how to do different disguises as well as disguising themselves. Each round you'll get half an hour to get disguised and the seeker will get 10 minutes to find you. How does that sound? Naruto's face had steadily grown lighter throughout the explanation until he was positively beaming. That sounds like a lot of fun. He said. What are we waiting for? For the first round, Satachi was the one to help Naruto. He made a pretty good disguise. Naruto's hair was dyed a pale green, his whisker marks covered by smudged dirt, and his clothes changed to blue shorts and a light green jacket as opposed to his previous black t-shirt and tan shorts. He was playing in the small playground just off the street. Points to Satachi for interpreting the rules creatively. Satachi had inverted the colors on his clothes as they were fairly nondescript and had put on a bandana to cover his blazing hair. Simple, but effective. Raiden wandered around for the better part of 5 minutes, examining some of the stalls there. Those pears looked particularly juicy, before heading over to the park and tapping Satachi on the shoulder. Hey, he said, and Naruto stood up and pouted at him. The time was almost up. He whined, and Raiden bopped him lightly on the head. Don't whine. Besides, you did pretty good for a first time. If you want to blame anyone, he grinned, blame Satachi. Hey. The team yelled, and Raiden and Naruto both laughed. I'd like to see you do better, he grumbled. Raiden's smile turned predatory. Okay then. Just remember, you wished for it. Raiden waited for Satachi to go out of sight before he made a move. Transform. When the smoke cleared, Naruto gaped. Raiden had turned himself into a woman a bit older than his actual age. Average height, brown hair of an average length, dark brown eyes. She was wearing a modest but expensive-looking dress and civilian sandals. What, Raiden? The woman winked. SHHH, call me mom. You're an Ari, alright. Okay. Raiden then took his hand and led him towards a store. A makeup store. Why are we going here? You can't do a transformation jutsu yet, so we're disguising you the old-fashioned way. It's a good skill to have if you want to be a ninja, because some ninja can sense when you use chakra. That makes sense, Naruto said, nodding. We have to cover up your whisker marks, so we have to find a bit of makeup that will match your skin tone to put over them. And new hair dye, of course we'll make your hair a little darker than mine. The eyes we can't do much about, as you're still a little young for contacts. Okay then, Naruto said. I'll go along with it, as long as it isn't too itchy. Of course, Raiden said, amusement coloring his tone. He went in and headed straight to where they kept their makeup and grabbed the one he always used when he needed to disguise himself. Thankfully, the brand was actually available and in the same spot as it was in the future. It was also fortunate that he had the same skin tone at age 6 as he did at age 18. He also picked up a bottle of hair dye on his way to the checkout. Once those purchases were made, Raiden took Naruto back to the apartment, dropped the transformation, and washed him off and applied the dye and makeup. You look totally different already. Raiden announced, letting Naruto see himself in the mirror. The boy's eyes widened and he touched his face. Whoa. Raiden redid his transformation. One more thing, he said. What do you notice about the dress? It looks expensive, Naruto replied. And what about your clothes? They're not as expensive and a lot dirtier. His face lit up. We don't match. I need to change clothes, right? That's right. Raiden said with a note of approval. But you don't have really fancy looking clothes, so we're going to go get some really quickly. Hey, are you sure? Naruto asked hesitantly. It's a lot of money. It'll be fine, Raiden said. I've got plenty. And he could always go catch a couple Nukenin if he wanted more. One new outfit later, Naruto looked like a proper little rich civilian and 27 minutes had passed. It was time to go wander the street. Naruto, remember, your name is Inari, I'm going to be acting like your mother and you are going to get to act like a spoiled little kid who's bored out of his mind. They walked around, Raiden skipping some of the cheaper stalls and staying longer at the more costly booths. Naruto played his part to a T, scuffing his shoes on the ground and sighing and tugging on Raiden's sleeves, the occasional complaint added in. At one point Satachi even bumped into Raiden, but he chewed him out, complaining about her dress and how much it cost, which cowed Satachi so thoroughly he didn't so much as glance in Naruto's direction and hurried away. Once he'd gotten far enough away, they looked at each other and snickered before continuing along the street. Soon enough, 10 minutes was up and they went back to Naruto's apartment to wait for Satachi. What took you so long? Naruto asked as soon as they caught a glimpse of Satachi's red hair. Satachi looked up and gaped, at which Raiden dropped his transformation. That was you? He said incredulously. Naruto burst out laughing and even Raiden couldn't keep the smile off of his face. Sure was. I thought I was dead meat. Satachi exclaimed, coming closer, and Naruto started laughing as well. And of course, Naruto's laughter was contagious, so they were all laughing as they entered the apartment. Naruto collapsed onto the couch, and Raiden and Satachi both sat down on chairs. It took a while, but eventually they were all calm enough to speak. "Shall I make dinner, then?" Raiden asked. Satachi and Naruto nodded, small lines of drool appearing at the corners of their mouths. Raiden laughed before standing and heading into the kitchen. He popped his head back out again a few seconds later. "If you want to eat tonight, you'd better come in here and help." Naruto was at school again and Satachi was back at work, so Raiden was left alone. He had several options of what to do with his day and was at a loss about what he should do first. House hunting was a viable option, but so was getting some training in. He hadn't had a proper spar since Danzo. There was also the task of writing down all the different recipes he knew, at least the ones that were healthy, because he didn't know how good of a cook Satachi was and he wanted Naruto to get proper nutrition. He'd start with house hunting. He'd prefer a house for rent. If they had to move because of additions, it would be less of a hassle than trying to resell a house. Now where to go for that? The Hokage's office couldn't be the only room in that giant building, right? So he made his way over to the administrative building, stopping occasionally to look at things he found interesting. There was a store dedicated just to selling umbrellas, who knew? He was stopped at a candy store, debating whether or not to go inside and get something for Naruto and Satachi and maybe indulge his own sweet tooth when a hand clapped him on the shoulder. Raiden turned to see a man quite a bit bigger than himself, at least 15 centimeters taller and 10 kilograms heavier, staring down at him. "Do you see the sign?" the man asked imperiously. "What sign?" The man pointed at a sign on the shop front window. "No loitering." Apparently it was a crime to stand in front of the shop. "Sorry about that," Raiden said, extricating himself from the man's grip. He backed away, but while doing so caught sight of the insignia on the man's shoulder. "Uchiha-san." The man grunted, giving him a last sharp look, and Raiden looked at the ground, deep in thought, as he continued towards the Hokage tower. The Uchiha were still alive. Alive. This was something he needed to deliberate on. From his reckoning of the current date, he still had just over a year before the massacre happened. So at this point the coup was nothing more than whisperings in the dark. From what Raiden remembered, it was the elders that had been pressuring the clan the hardest to revolt. Any drastic action that would have to be taken would have to happen soon, and it would have to take out the elders of the clan. He didn't want to risk taking the issue to the Hokage, as he was technically a newcomer to the village. Danzo was even more out of the question, as he had supported the massacre, even going so far as to steal eyes from the corpses, and, of course, there was the teeny-tiny problem of having Freedom in aim. Well, that would have to wait. He looked up at the round red walls and smiled. It was nice to see it again, this building in which he had spent so much time as a child. He walked in and stopped at the front desk, which was maybe the third or fourth time he'd done it in his entire life. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Where would I go to find a property to rent?" The old lady didn't even look up as she said, "Third door on the left." "Thanks." Raiden turned away from the cranky desk lady and made his way to the housing office. Hopefully the person there would be of a better disposition. As it turned out, he was lucky the person running the housing office was a younger woman, though still rather no-nonsense. Still, that no-nonsense attitude was beneficial to an office setting as it translated into greater efficiency. Which was good for everyone because it took less time to figure things out. Raiden left only a couple hours later with a folder under his arm and a list of addresses in his hand to check out that he quickly sealed into his belt. He'd do that later, though, he wasn't going to choose a place to live without both Naruto and Satachi's input. And that would have to wait until both Satachi and Naruto were free, which wouldn't be for several hours yet. Plenty of time to wander around and get reacquainted with the Leaf Village from his youth. He wasn't overly familiar with the layout, as it had been almost 3 years from his perspective since the village had been destroyed by pain, and he had only been in the village for a couple months before that, having just returned from his training journey with Jiraiya. Not to mention the general change that happened in larger villages constantly. Up one street, down another there was the ninja supplies shop. Now that he thought about it, that was where Satachi was working. Had he worked there when Raiden was young? Or was it because of his arrival in this time that he decided to come to Konoha? The next street over was the higher-end shopping district, really only affordable to the really rich civvies and those to Kujo or above, so, not something he'd be visiting often. Ooh, that was a nice neighborhood. Going straight past the clan district was a must. The clans didn't move and weren't appreciative of outsiders lurking around their land. Although, he did catch sight of the Uchiha district through the gate opening. That was weird. After he felt he'd sufficiently reacquainted himself with the village, Raiden decided to peruse the training grounds for a suitable sparring partner. He headed to the nearest one, Training Ground 9, and heard the distinctive swish-clink thud that characterized shuriken techniques. Excellent, someone was there. He made his way to the edge of the clearing and was surprised to see an Uchiha his own age standing in deep concentration, holding several shuriken. The Uchiha's eyes snapped open and he let loose, flinging the shuriken in several different directions, causing them to ricochet into the various targets around the edges of the clearing. Raiden only noticed at the last second that one was heading for his face and batted it away with a metal plate on the back of his glove. "Nice," he said, appreciative of the level of skill that went into mastering a jutsu like that. Raiden still had less patience for that sort of thing, preferring to utilize his massive chakra stores and stamina and blunt force ninjutsu and taijutsu attacks, rather than develop the finesse needed for shuriken and other weapon attacks. "Who are you?" the guy said in an easygoing manner, but Raiden saw the hint of steel in his expression. "Raiden Uzumaki, here is a messenger from AIM," he said. "Don't worry, I'm legal. I was just looking for someone to spar with while I wait for the Hokage and council to process the message I was sent with." The Uchiha's posture relaxed slightly, even though the suspicion hadn't completely disappeared from his eyes. "Alright then. I'm Shisui Uchiha. I'm assuming you want to spar right now." Shisui, the name sounded familiar. "That's right," Raiden said, a smile growing on his face. "Don't want to get soft, do I?" Shisui laughed. "I'll let you warm up. No sense in starting when you're not ready, right?" Raiden nodded, welcoming the banter. He knew he wouldn't be able to rely on nature chakra or any of Kurama's, so he'd warm up properly in order to get the most out of the spar. He had no idea what Shisui was capable of and wasn't about to underestimate him. That was just asking for a beatdown. "Any rules?" Raiden asked. "The jutsu only," Shisui suggested. "That way at least there's a smaller chance of us accidentally killing each other." Raiden nodded. It sounded good to him. Eventually Raiden was finished warming up and he and Shisui took up positions on the opposite side of the clearing. A single leaf detached itself from the tree and as soon as it hit the ground the two of them moved. There was a blur of fists and feet that lasted barely a second and the two of them separated. "You're fast," the both of them said at the same time, then grinned at each other. Raiden touched his jaw where a bruise was forming and Shisui wiped a bit of blood from the corner of his mouth, then both of them rushed at each other again. An hour later, the two of them were flopped on the ground. Raiden was grinning and he could hear Shisui laughing breathlessly. "We have to do this again sometime," Shisui said once they'd rested for a couple of minutes. "Agreed," Raiden affirmed. "I'm not going to be here for too long, though, a couple more weeks at most." "That sucks," Shisui said. "Well, come on." Raiden accepted the hand Shisui was holding out and got pulled into an upright position. "What's your rank?" Shisui asked, looking at him curiously. Raiden smiled sheepishly and rubbed the back of his head. I don't have one." Shisui stopped dead. "What do you mean you don't have one? We were on pretty equal grounds back there and I'm no lightweight." "Yeah, you're Anbu, right?" Raiden asked. Shisui gave him a sharp look and Raiden explained hurriedly. "I mean you're wearing short sleeves and it's not really hard to see." Shisui's suspicion visibly lessened as he replied. "Yeah, I'm Anbu. Which makes it so odd that you're so strong and not ranked." They turned the corner of the street, heading into the village proper. "Well," Raiden said, getting ready to recount his backstory, "I grew up around a lot of missing nin and there was one that was my teacher for a while, so I acquired some skills and have been working on them for a while. Not to mention my Uzumaki blood." "Yeah, that's right. Uzumaki. Does that mean you have a bloodline, then?" Raiden shrugged. "Kind of. The Uzumaki clan is really different than a lot of the more traditional clans. We generally have more potent chakra, as well as more chakra in general, which causes us to be more long-lived. There's also the sealing. All Uzumaki have a particular affinity for the sealing arts, so it's more of an instinctual thing. As for bloodlines, well, we don't have a particular bloodline, but almost all of the members develop some sort of special ability." "What's yours?" Shisui asked, his curiosity piqued. Raiden recalled that the academy didn't really teach anything about the Uzumaki clan. "Well, that's kind of personal," he informed him, "but I don't mind it. I happen to have a particular affinity for nature chakra. Basically, I'm a sage." Raiden really enjoyed the way Shisui's jaw dropped. But how old are you?" 19. Shisui's eyes bugged out. "You're the same age as me. And a sage. If it helps, I first learned to fully control my sage abilities when I was 16. Shisui shook his head. "And they say the Uchiha clan is the strongest. Geez." Raiden just laughed. The time until Raiden's departure passed in a blur of activity. They were able to decide on a small house to rent, and while Naruto was at school and Satachi at work, Raiden would clean it up and make sure everything worked. Once that was done, he started moving the furniture over, which his seals and shadow clones made infinitely easier. Moving and cleaning, however, was not an easy task, and so Raiden would take breaks in which he would seek out his newfound friend for a spar or just to hang out while a clone continued the work. It was really a good system. On day 11 of his stay in Konoha, he returned to the Hokage's office to collect the response to Yahiko's missive. The Hokage gravely informed him that his own response would be given to Raiden just before he left, as he didn't want the letter floating around the village. Raiden gave him a sheepish grin. He'd noticed the Anbu tailing him and figured the old man was keeping track of his actions and had inferred that Raiden didn't plan to leave before his visa expired. Raiden woke up. The sun was bright, streaming through the gap in the curtains to illuminate a strip of the ceiling. Today was the day he would have to leave, and he was dreading saying goodbye. He marveled at the strength of the attachments he'd formed in his short time. Satachi, Naruto, even Shisui. He'd missed them. He got out of bed and went into the kitchen, pulling out the ingredients for pancakes, which Naruto had shown a particular inclination for. He didn't make them often as they weren't particularly healthy, but he wanted to do as much for Naruto as he could in reparation for his immediate departure. The sleepy boy soon stumbled into the kitchen, shortly followed by a yawning but slightly more awake Satachi. Smells good, Satachi said, and Naruto perked up as he caught the scent of breakfast. You made pancakes? Yes. Raiden smiled, flipping 3 at once onto a plate and handing it to Naruto, who set it on the table and promptly drowned it in syrup. He sighed. Satachi chuckled and got his own plate and proceeded to do the exact same thing. Well. If he couldn't beat them, he might as well join them, right? He sat with a small stack of his own, leaving the pan on the cooling stove. I have to leave today, Raiden announced abruptly. I have to deliver something back to AIM. I'll probably be gone for a few weeks, at least, before I come back here. Naruto's eyes were shiny, and Satachi frowned. Do you have to go, Raiden? He asked. Raiden reached over and ruffled his hair. I'm afraid I do, Naruto, he said. But don't worry, I'll be back before you know it. And if you have any trouble, just go to Satachi. He's pretty cool too, you know. Still, it was awfully quiet for the rest of the time until Naruto left for school. Satachi helped him clean up from breakfast and then punched his shoulder. You better come back, you hear? He said purposefully, then left for his own job. Raiden made his way over to the Hokage's tower and then up to the old man's office. He needed to get the details of the mission, and he assumed that there would be a small party of Leaf Ninja accompanying him as well that he would have to meet. Sure enough, once he actually entered the office he was introduced to the 3 ninja that were to go along with him. 2 were a couple years older, he recognized them faintly from the 4th war Aoba Yamashiro and Raido Namiashi. The 3rd was younger, maybe even younger than Raiden was. He'd been the proctor for the 3rd stage of the Genin exam. Hey, it's something. I have assigned Namiashi-san, Yamashiro-san, and Height-san will be traveling with you to AIM as added security and a show of good faith. I hope this will not prove a problem. The Hokage asked gravely. Should be fine, Raiden replied. Then here is your message, he said, handing Raiden a rather surprisingly thick scroll. Raiden accepted it and slipped it into his pocket. That's it? He asked. The Hokage nodded, looking faintly amused. That's it. Well, guys, Raiden said, turning to the 3 ninja behind him, ready to go. The 3 of them looked at each other and then turned back to him and nodded, a bit confused at his rather unprofessional behavior. All right then. Follow me. Raiden walked all the way to the gate, where he waved to the guards at the security station cheekily. He looked back good, they were all right behind him. Okay then, he started, turning around so he could walk and speak to them at the same time. As you probably already know, I'm Raiden Uzumaki, and we're delivering an important document to AIM, which I am a citizen of. We can probably make it there in about 4 days if we keep a good pace. Sounds good to me, Aoba said. I'm Aoba Yamashiro, by the way. Raido Namiashi. And I'm Gekko Hate. It's nice to meet you, Uzumaki-san. Please, just call me Raiden. I never was one for formalities. They nodded their assent. What do you all think about staying in Tanzaku tonight? I know it's got a reputation, but it's got really nice places to stay. Aoba and Raido grinned. Hate looked faintly disapproving. He'd learn. Raiden got them checked into a hotel easily. One only needed a bit of cash to speed things up, and they got 2 decent rooms. Nothing fancy, but they had separate beds, and the rooms weren't too costly. They'd made it there earlier than Raiden had expected, however, so he decided to add to his stock of money. He'd burned all the money he'd had from the future, literally burning it, as in charred to ashes, as he didn't want to get labeled as a counterfeiter after all. The date was wrong on the bills, and so he was running a little short on cash, especially after setting aside most of the rent money for the apartment in Konoha. He knocked on the door to the other room. He and Hate were together in one room, the other was Aoba and Raido, and stuck his head in. Anyone want some quick cash? He asked. I've never lost a game of chance, so if you want some money come now. We've still got a couple hours to burn. The 2 of them stood and followed him out. What about the scroll? Hate asked, appearing from the other room. Raiden grinned. Don't worry about it, it's sealed into my belt. And trust me, I'm no civilian. So the four of them went out to one of the gambling halls. Raiden was really the only one who did any betting or actual playing, but he shared the profits equally with the other three, on the grounds that they were his moral support. It wasn't long until he found himself participating in a game of poker with several other people. The game was about to begin when someone sat across the table from him. "I'd like to play too," he heard, and looked up from the table to see none other than Tsunade. He stood quickly, nearly toppling his chair. "What are you doing here?" he said, before remembering that Tsunade wasn't actually the Hokage at that point in time. He didn't know why he didn't remember he'd seen the third just that morning. She looked at him critically. "Do I know you?" He sat back down, scratching the back of his head in embarrassment. "Not really, I've heard of you, though." "Well, get ready to be disappointed, kid, whatever you've heard about me probably isn't true." She picked up her hand and the game began. A smile grew on Raiden's face. "How about this, if I win, you talk to me. If I lose, I won't ever bother you again." "I take that bet," Tsunade said confidently. "I'm not going to lose, I've already won something today, and my luck runs in streaks." So they played, and to nobody's surprise, Raiden was the winner. Tsunade growled and smacked the table. "What do you want to talk about then? If I don't want to talk about it, I'm leaving, and if you try to follow me I'll smack you black and blue." "Calm down, Bachan," Raiden said, and winced as her killer intent formed a visible aura around her. Lucky for him, Shizune appeared right at that moment. "Tsunade-sama," she hissed, "you have to calm down." The aura subsided, and Raiden chanced to glance back at his temporary teammates. They were wide-eyed, impressed at whatever he'd just exhibited. Even Raiden himself wasn't sure if it was daring or just plain stupidity. "Let's go somewhere more private and talk. And I mean that in the most literal way, as right here is rather crowded and noisy and doesn't smell all too great." So Raiden led their small group back to the hotel room they'd gotten for the night, collecting his tall stack of cash on his way out of the gambling hall. Shizune and Tsunade sat on the edge of one of the beds, Hayate and himself on another, and Aoba and Raito on chairs. "Can you tell me about Mito?" Raiden asked. "Mito?" Tsunade's face was a mask of confusion. "Why, oh. That red hair, you're in Uzumaki, aren't you?" "Sure am," Raiden said proudly. "And you are too, aren't you? At least a little bit. She was your grandmother, right, Tsunade of the Sannin?" Hayate gasped and Raito and Aoba still they apparently hadn't recognized her either. Maybe they were expecting her to look older. She let out a huff of amusement. "That's all it is, then. Fine, I'll tell you a few stories." Raiden listened, enraptured, as he heard about one of his ancestors for the first time. It was illuminating. He learned several aspects of Uzumaki culture he hadn't heard about before, including something about a temple of masks. Aoba and Raito left about halfway through the storytelling, but as Hayate was sleeping in the room they were in, he sat and listened. Eventually, though, the clock struck 11, and Raiden had to interrupt. They had to be up early the next day, as the next leg of their journey was the longest and would take the most time to travel. Tsunade and Shizune left, and as Shizune passed Raiden, she hugged him and thanked him, saying, "She hasn't looked so well, happy isn't the right word, maybe at peace. In a long time." After they left, he sprawled out on his bed, exhausted. It had been an exciting day meeting a new team, several hours of travel, a couple hours of gambling, resulting in a hefty addition to his wallet, a small but explosive confrontation with a wayward relative, and a wealth of stories about a prominent member of his clan. Not bad. The next day, as expected, started quite early, none of the ninjas suffering in any way from the excitement of the night before, thanks to Raiden's watch on the time and refusal to let them touch any alcohol. They traveled most of the day, stopping only for the occasional bathroom break, as well as a break for lunch. They ended up camping that night, stopping to set up camp just before it got dark. The small fire jutsu got the fire started, and Raiden pulled out some soup flavoring packets and a pot from the seals on his belt. Aoba caught a couple of rabbits, Hayate got some water, and they made stew. "Wow, Raiden," Aoba said. "Do you just put everything into your seals?" Raiden laughed self-consciously. "Well, kind of," he admitted. "When I first got to Konoha I went to deliver the message to the Hokage, and I couldn't find it. It took me several hours to sort through all the stuff I had in here before I remembered I'd put it in my actual pocket for convenience." They laughed at him then, even Raito, who was unusually taciturn, cracked a smile. They slept soon after that. Raiden set up security seals around the campsite, so only one person would have to stand watch at a time. The next morning they decided not to sleep in. The sooner they left, the sooner they would arrive in Aim the day after. They spent the day similar to the one previous, not too much talking, all of them intent on getting to Aim as soon as possible. The fourth day of travel was the one in which they would arrive in Omegakure. The night before, the landscape had begun to transition, becoming less forested and more flat. Raiden cautioned them as they approached. "It gets quite slick here sometimes, as it rains so much and there's a lot of mud, so watch your step." He pulled out a waterproofed cloak from his seal and wrapped it around his shoulders. He looked at his companions, who all looked a bit travel-weary and confused, and pulled out a scroll from a seal on his belt and opened it, looking through all the different storage seals. He made a sound of triumph and held up another scroll, unsealing a further 4 waterproof cloaks from the scroll, resealing one and handing out the 3 to the Leaf Ninja. "Put them on, you're gonna want them when it rains." And not 20 minutes after that it started pouring. Raiden put his hood up, looking back at his companions who were all looking very grateful and very dry under the hoods of their own cloaks. Barely an hour after it had started raining, Raiden began to see the jagged skyline emerge on the horizon. "We're getting close, guys," he said. "Don't worry about security, you're with me, so you'll be let in no problem." Aoba and Raiden nodded, but Hate looked a little concerned. "But we're ninja from a different village and we're carrying weapons. Why would being with you make a difference, especially since there are 3 of us and only 1 of you?" Raiden smirked. "It doesn't make a difference because they know if you made a move against me or the leader, you would all be incapacitated in a split second." He said this innocently, with barely a touch of killing intent, which didn't really reassure Hade in the slightest. Raiden knew none of the members of the team had seen any of his advanced skills. They knew he could use chakra to augment his muscles and climb on trees and use storage seals, but those were among the most basic of a shinobi's skills. They would be in for a rude awakening if he ever did decide to exhibit some of his more impressive jutsu. "Just follow me and you'll be fine." They made it to the small city easily enough and were stopped at the gates by a couple of guards. Raiden dropped his hood and flashed his ID. "Sorry, Raiden," one said. "We didn't know it was you," the other explained. "That's fine," he replied. "It's good, it shows you're taking your job seriously." The guards beamed, and Raiden knew the Leaf Ninja were watching his interactions with a close eye. "They're with me," he added, pointing over his shoulder with his thumb at the 3 bedraggled-looking figures that were the rest of his team. "Well then, welcome back," the first guard said, and Raiden entered the village. He turned back to his temporary teammates. He spread his arms out as if to encompass the view of the city. "Welcome to Omegakure." Chapter end. Alright, that's it for today's video, guys. Let me know in the comments section how was the story, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video. Peace out.